My basic argument as a realist is that states operate in an anarchic system. That means there's no higher authority in the state system. And the principal goal, not the only goal by any means, but the principal goal of states is survival. If you're in an anarchic system, a system with no higher authority, and you're dealing with other states that might have malign intentions and might also have a lot of military capability, the best way to survive, and again, survival is the principal goal, is to be the most powerful state in the system. And you will go to great lengths to make sure that is the case.
Let's talk a little about realism to set the stage for this, because your view of international law, I mean, my view is that international law has to become more and more important and more widely adhered to for the sake of the planet and the United States, and that the United States should lead in the growing compliance with international law. Your line on that is, Bob, wake up. We're living in the real world here. There's never been consistent compliance with international law by great powers, and I don't believe, if I understand you correctly, you really recommend it. So, but before we get into that, because your view is so grounded in the school of thought known as realism, and in fact, I should say, you are one of the preeminent scholars of this thing called realism in international relations. I think if political scientists were asked to name, a few major realists among American political scientists, you would certainly get mentioned. Why don't you tell us what you see realism as being? What is your, if you're talking to somebody who doesn't know anything about political theory and they're asking you what it means for you to call yourself a realist in international relations thought, what do you say?
My basic argument as a realist is that states operate in an anarchic system. That means there's no higher authority in the state system. And the principal goal, not the only goal by any means, but the principal goal of states is survival. If you're in an anarchic system, a system with no higher authority, and you're dealing with other states that might have malign intentions and might also have a lot of military capability, the best way to survive, and again, survival is the principal goal, is to be the most powerful state in the system. And you will go to great lengths to make sure that is the case, right? So realists like me believe that the structure of the international system, the fact that it's anarchic and you can never know the intentions of other states, is what causes those states to compete with each other for power and to pay so much attention to the balance of power. That, in essence, I think, Bob, is what realism is all about, at least for John Mearsheimer.
Okay, so it's kind of a jungle out there, at least in the sense that there is no state level authority governing the planet. There's no police department to go to when your country is in trouble. I mean, you can appeal to nations, you can appeal to the United Nations. And sometimes, military force has been authorized by the United Nations to roll back aggression. But by and large, you're saying, look, you certainly can't count on that in any consistent way. It's a jungle out there. So you should expect states to, take matters into their own hands in defending their interests. And if that means violating the rule of law, if they see their self-interest as tied to violating the rule of law and they think they can get away with it, violating international law, you should expect to see it, and you shouldn't really expect that ever to change. Is that fair?
Yeah. Let me just put a somewhat finer point on it. I think that great powers who basically write the rules or write international law understand that rules matter, institutions matter, international law matters. It's in the interest of great powers to have lots of rules in the modern world. So there's no dispute between you and me on that. I think where you and I differ is that I believe that if a great power thinks that its vital interests are threatened by obeying a rule or a law that it wrote, in such a case, it will violate the rule. It will violate the law. It will do whatever is necessary to protect itself, to guarantee its survival. Now, very importantly, Bob, this does not happen often because the great powers write the rules so that they suit the great powers' interests. So obviously, you're not going to have a whole heck of a lot of cases where the great powers feel compelled to violate those rules or those laws. But every once in a while, you'll run into an important case where a state, a great power in particular, decides that the rules counteract what are the state's vital interests. And in that case, it will axiomatically violate the rules. That's the basic argument here.
Okay. And, this is a good opportunity to talk a little maybe about specific incarnations of international law, because, people hear the term. A lot of people don't know exactly what we're referring to. But why don't we talk about some specific, laws, bodies of law, and institutions that are kind of the incarnations of the law, particularly maybe those that were created around the mid 20th century in the wake of World War II, because I think you'll probably consider this a good example of the great powers writing the rules in the first place, right? The U.S. after World War II was in a very strong position to influence the writing of rules. So why don't you give us some examples of how international law evolved in the wake of World War II that illustrate your point about the role of great powers in crafting international law?
Okay. I think one really good example would be the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which basically the Soviets...
So that's early 1960s.
Actually, 1968. I think there was movement towards crafting an NPT starting in the early 60s, but 1968 is usually the date that is put on it. And it was, I think, ratified in 1970. But the key point here is that both the United States and the Soviet Union, which were the only two great powers on the planet during the Cold War, they decided that the proliferation problem was getting out of hand and that something had to be done to stem the tide of nuclear proliferation. So they got together and they effectively wrote the NPT, which is a series of rules or laws. And the NPT, of course, is an institution. So you can see how all these words are synonymous. And what the Soviets and the Americans did was they wrote rules that were in their interest because both of those superpowers had no interest in proliferation. And they then worked together to force other states to sign the NPT and then obey the NPT so that there would be no more proliferation. Of course, there was a bit more proliferation after 1968, but the NPT helped a lot. And this is a good example, Bob, of how rules served the interests of great powers. The NPT has worked to the advantage of the Americans and the Soviets, now the Russians. So rules are a good thing. But you also want to remember that when we wrote the NPT, we wrote into it that the United States and the Soviet Union would go to great lengths to reduce and ultimately eliminate their nuclear weapons. In other words, if the great powers are saying the smaller powers can't have nuclear weapons, one would expect the great powers to eventually get rid of their own nuclear weapons. But if you look at the arms racing that took place during the latter part of the Cold War after the NPT was signed, and if you look at what the Americans are doing now in terms of expanding their nuclear capabilities, it's hard to say that we have been obeying the rules of the NPT. We concoct stories that try to show that, yes, we have been living up to the rules. But in fact, I don't think we have, and I don't think we ever have. I think we will keep our nuclear weapons, expand our nuclear arsenal, and arms race with the Chinese in the decades ahead. But that really violates the treaty, in my opinion.
Yeah. A slightly different kind of example, I think, although it ultimately does serve to make your point, probably, is the law governing, war, lawful and unlawful war. Ostensibly, that is doesn't favor anybody. It's against transborder aggression. And if you are attacked, you have a right to defend yourself. If you commit transborder aggression, you have violated international law. On the other hand, if you look at the mechanism of enforcement that was built after World War II, it gives more power to a few countries than to others, because the to authorize the use of force if it's any kind of unclear case, like, for example, us invading Iraq in 2003, or if there's any kind of unclear case and you want to have international law on your side, it's not obvious you're responding to transborder aggression, but you want to call your war lawful. There's a way to do it. You get the Security Council to authorize it and say that, you're acting on behalf of international peace and security or something or other, and then it will be lawful. But the way the institution was set up, only five countries have the power to veto action by the Security Council, and we are one of those. And the other four, I guess, were all maybe allies at the time this was set up, and three of them still are. I guess two of them still are. But in any event, you can see how the system was set up so that we have disproportionate influence over what the Security Council does and does not deem a lawful war. And as the Iraq War illustrates, when we cannot get a vote in favor of. So in other words, we could veto, like if Russia wanted to invade some country and get Security Council authorization, we could veto that. On the other hand, because Russia is one of those five great powers, it could veto our request for authorization to invade, say, Iraq. And in fact, Iraq is an example where, because of the way the system was set up, we could not get Security Council authorization to invade. So this illustrates another of your points, namely that when the international law was not on our side, we just ignored it. We just invaded Iraq, right? So I guess we've now shown examples of both different ways international law and its attendant institutions can be set up to favor great powers, and how at least one great power has been known to disregard international law when it doesn't see that as in its interest. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think the story you're telling is a very realist story. Whether it's right or wrong is another matter, but that is the realist story I would tell. Yeah.
And, it's funny. One interesting thing about realism is that it has both a descriptive and a prescriptive side. I mean, I guess not all realists get in the business of recommending policies, but you certainly express your opinions. And we think of realism as having, on the one hand, a description of the world, which we kind of cover, and on the other hand, certain kinds of policy preferences you tend to see in realists that is thought to correspond somehow to that, to the description, the diagnosis, I guess you might say. And we haven't yet moved from one to the other. In other words, we haven't yet gotten into what you think policy should be. But first, can you tell me, am I right that you don't see this in all IR schools of thought? Do you? International relations schools of thought. In other words, or maybe you do, because you kind of do with, I guess, what's called, well, you tell me, do you always see both a descriptive and a prescriptive dimension of these schools of thought, or is realism unusual in the extent to which both are associated with it?
No, you see it in all of the major theories in international politics. Just take the three canonical liberal theories. One is that economic interdependence produces peace. Number two is that democracies don't fight each other. Therefore, spreading democracy across the planet will make for a more peaceful world. And number three, institutions, which is, of course, what you and I are talking about today, institutions are really good because if you can embed countries in institutions, they obey rules. And if you write rules that limit conflict and promote cooperation, the fact that states become obedient to the rules facilitates peace. So if you look at liberal hegemony, which is the foreign policy that the United States pursued during the unipolar moment, it was based on the three canonical liberal theories. And those liberal theories, much like my version of realism, has explanatory power and prescriptive power.